All right, great. Time to start. Good morning. My name is Steve Marr. I'm with Risk Management Professionals, and welcome to our ongoing series of various topics associated with process safety management, risk management programs, and if you get an offshore facility, SIMS. As usual, we're doing multiple broadcasts. I'm broadcasting from Irvine, California. Your main speaker, Teresa Marion, will be speaking from our Philadelphia, Pennsylvania office, and we're going to be covering a very important topic for all facilities today, and that's compliance audits. But before we do that, just a little word about logistics. Because this is a webinar and it has the ability to do two-way communications, that portion of it from the participants, not from the speaker, but from the participants, is going to be muted during the course of the presentation so that everybody can hear and nobody's distracted by cell phones, alternate meetings, etc. If you do have any technical problems, please feel free to call the main office number. That's 877-532-0806. Or you can dial one of the local numbers too, 949-282-0123. That'll get you through to somebody who will be glad to help out. And also, if you have any questions or important topics for the either the producer, Nicole Otramba, or our speaker, Teresa Marion, please feel free to use the chat window on your WebEx interface to get somebody's attention. Later on, there will be time for question and answer. You're welcome to do it vocally and ask to be unmuted, or you're welcome to pose your question either directly or anonymously via the chat window. So that's how things work, and without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Teresa Marion. Teresa got her bachelor's degree in engineering from the University of California, Riverside, and also received an MBA from Walden. And she'll be talking about a very important topic that she's got a lot of experience with, and that's compliance audits, and offering quite a few practical tips on how to do them. These audits are very important for those of you who did your initial submittals in 1999 and stayed on 3-year cycles for your compliance audits. The next cycle for that is the year 2011. So there'll be a lot of people updating their compliance audits, which are a very important measure of the health of your process safety programs at your plant site, and a lot of people will be doing that in 2011. Also, for those of you who have got offshore facilities, the recent regulations that came out, SIMS, have ratcheted down quite a bit in terms of how to do the compliance audits, submitting audit plans to the regulators up front, and also submitting the results of the audit within 30 days after the completion of the audit. So whether you're an onshore refrigeration facility, chlorination facility, refinery, or you have offshore facilities, all of you have to do compliance audits, and which are a very important part of your program. So without further ado, let me go ahead and turn it over to Teresa Marion, who will get to the meat of the presentation.
Good morning. Thank you, Steve, for the introduction. To all participants, as Steve mentioned, I'm Teresa Marion, and I'm the Northeast Engineering Manager for Risk Management Professional, located out of our Pennsylvania office. I do split time, however, from our corporate office in California and out here on the East Coast. Today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, compliance audits. I actually get involved with a lot of facilities in conducting compliance audits. A lot of facilities call me and they want me to come in, audit their programs, find their deficiencies, and then develop a plan of action to correct those deficiencies. So as I said, today we're going to go through compliance audits. The key topics that I'd like to cover in this presentation is I'm going to start off by giving you a short introduction. We'll go through the compliance audit requirements, and then we'll go through some tips and hints on how to actually conduct an audit. We'll follow up with a prevention program review tip, and then a question and answer period at the end. So starting off with our introduction, as many of you are aware, any facility having a hazardous chemical over the EPA's risk management plan threshold quantity must submit to the EPA and implement an RMP program. In addition, any facility meeting OSHA's process safety management threshold quantities must also implement a PSM program. The main purpose of an RMP program and a PSM program is to document that personnel are safely operating and maintaining these processes that are utilizing what is considered a hazardous material. They also ensure that management are dedicating minimum resources needed to prevent accidental release of these hazardous materials, such as training, equipment and maintenance, and personnel. For an EPA risk management plan, there are many different elements to the program. So there's a submittal element, a management program, a hazard assessment, the real meat and beef of your program, which is going to be the prevention program element, and an emergency response program element. You'll see that I noted for an OSHA process safety management PSM program specific, they only are going to require the prevention program element. So I provided a table here with an EPA Risk Management Plan Program 3 and an OSHA Process Safety Management. I told you the bulk of the programs are those prevention program elements. As you can see here, I've listed them out for an RMP Program 3 or an OSHA PSM program. So your prevention program elements are going to include items such as process safety information, process hazard analysis, operating procedures, training. There's a whole list of them. And you'll see between EPA, RMP, and OSHA PSM, they're very identical in the requirements and very similar in requiring each of these prevention program elements. You'll see that I specifically highlighted compliance audits because for an EPA RMP program and an OSHA process safety management program, they do have a compliance audit prevention program requirement, and that's what we're going to discuss today. So let's get into those requirements. RMP and PSM, as I said in the previous slide, have nearly identical requirements. For the compliance audit prevention program element, they specifically require that you certify evaluation of compliance with these regulations every 3 years. They also require that on your compliance audit team, it consists of at least one person knowledgeable in the process. They want you to document the findings of a compliance audit. If you find deficiencies, address those deficiencies, and also retain the 2 most recent audit reports on file at this facility. Getting into some more best practices, when you're conducting a compliance audit, I always tell facilities, you not only want to determine if the regulatory requirements are met, but also use the compliance audit as a time to ensure the effectiveness of the program on site and that this program is being implemented correctly. And what I mean by this is many of those prevention program elements are going to require the use of forms, the use of different items. So as you go through and audit a facility, you want to make sure that these are being effectively used on site. Another thing that's very important to any compliance audit is objectivity. We want to remain objective. For the compliance audit, you can do it internally at your facility. However, if you're going to do that, you've got to remember to remain objective. It's either, yes, I'm in compliance, or no, it's not, oh, well, I'm close to meeting it. So we want to just remain as if we are an auditor, an EPA or OSHA coming on site, objective. The next item I list out is recommendations. As you go through your compliance audit, you're going to find deficiencies in the program. I've yet to visit a facility that had a perfect RMP PSM program. There's always going to be something that may need tweaked or fixed along the line. And so when you go through the audit, it's important that as you find these deficiencies, you're making recommendations. I add in there versus suggestions because with the compliance audit, once you put those recommendations in there, these are going to be items you have to follow up with. So you want to make sure that your recommendations are specific. We require that recommendation to meet a regulatory item. If you find, hey, this might be a good idea to do this and it's more suggestive in nature, I usually leave those aside out of the audit. Because once those suggestions, as I said, are put in that audit as a recommendation, it's going to require some follow-up action. So if you're putting more suggestive nature in there, you'll want to go ahead and leave that to the side so it doesn't require as much follow-through as a specific recommendation. The next thing I ask, with these recommendations, you need a mechanism to track them and follow through with the recommendations. And then lastly, I listed records retention. As I said previously, a lot of the prevention program elements are going to require that you maintain records. For example, if you have a training program, well, we're going to want to see training records for facility personnel showing that they've been trained. So as you go through the audit, it's important that you look at this record retention, you verify that these records are being maintained on site. So now let's get into actually conducting a compliance audit. Prior to your on-site visit or prior to the day of the audit, I always like to define an agenda and schedule. By developing an agenda, it gives individuals an idea of the activities of the day for the audit. It also helps in ensuring that we're scheduling the appropriate individuals to participate in the audit. In addition, when you're going to do an audit, it's always a good idea to schedule in advance, again, so we can make sure that the appropriate individuals can participate in the audit. I also don't have it listed here, but prior to conducting a compliance audit, it may be a good idea to also provide an information request. This helps facility personnel get in tune and get everything together as necessary to assist on your day of the audit. So when we go through and we decide we're going to conduct an audit, we want to make sure, as I said previously, we're scheduling the appropriate personnel to participate in the audit. Per the regulations, you are required on the compliance audit team to have one person knowledgeable in the process. However, here are some additional suggestions for the team. With your compliance audit team, obviously you want someone that is knowledgeable in the regulations and requirements, that knows what they're looking for, knows how they should be implemented. In addition, for many facilities, they will charge a certain individual with overall responsibility of the plan, meaning that is the main person that should know everything about that RMP PSM program on site. So we're really going to want to get that individual involved in on our compliance audit team. In addition, if you delegate sections of the program to different individuals, so if your company has a training department or a maintenance department, we'll want to get those individuals involved because they're going to help us in assisting that certain sections of the program we can verify the records. If you are a smaller facility, it may end up just being you and an operator, and that's fine. It's more if you are at a larger facility where you have multiple departments, that it comes in handy that we're getting the right people on the team to participate in the audit. So we went through, prior to the audit, we're defining the schedule, we're getting the appropriate people scheduled to participate in the audit. Now we get to the day of the audit. It's the day that we arrive on site to review information. That day of the audit, pretty plain and simple, we want to have a sign-in sheet to document individuals present or interviewed at the audit. In addition, I usually like to begin with the coordination meeting. And I'm going to go through each of these items on day of the audit in a little more detail on the following slide. So we're going to conduct a coordination meeting. When you go to do an audit, you definitely want a method to document the compliance audit results. It is required as part of the compliance audit that you develop a report of the findings. So we need a good method to document what we're finding on site. The day of the audit is when you're going to actually do your documentation review and interviews as applicable. And then at the end of the day, it's a good idea to pull the team back together and review the initial findings. I find that this gives them an idea of what's to come, per se, in the compliance audit report. So let's go through the day of the audit. As I said earlier, the day of the audit, I like to begin by conducting a coordination meeting. So we get everyone together, we do our introductions, make sure everyone knows each other, knows their titles, knows their purpose of the RMP PSM program, what they're involved with. I also like to use this time to explain the purpose of the audit. This gets everyone on the same page of, hey, this is what we're here for, this is what we're looking for, these are the requirements for a compliance audit, and so this is why we're having this meeting. In addition, I'd like to review the covered process and changes since the last compliance audit, and then also review facility organization. By reviewing the facility organization, it kind of gives you the lines of communication and gives you an idea of how different elements of the program may flow through the facility. Again, the coordination meeting gets us all on the same page so we understand what's going on. One important thing I like to note here during this coordination meeting is that, hey, you may be auditing your facility internally, or you may be auditing, if you're at the corporate level, one of the facilities under the corporation. Well, the idea is that we want to use this compliance audit to find deficiencies before EPA or OSHA come and audit us as a facility. Because you know, if EPA and OSHA come in and find these deficiencies, then we're getting fines, we're getting notices of violation. So we really are using this audit to correct those deficiencies before the EPA and OSHA come in. I always explain to facilities then, it's important that you're honest with me and truthful. It doesn't help you any to hide information from me, because then you're leaving it open for EPA or OSHA to come in and find that information and give you a violation. So we went through, as I said, we start by conducting a coordination meeting. Then we really get into our documentation review, and we need a method to document our review and our on-site activities. A lot of facilities will use compliance audit checklists for this. Compliance audit checklists work great. They ensure every regulatory requirement is addressed. They provide a record of the participants and of the information reviewed, and they're an efficient method for documenting the audit. However, I do always like to point out, and you're going to hear this numerous times throughout this presentation, I tell facilities, if you're going to do your audit on-site using the compliance audit checklist, that's fine. But remember, you want to make it more than just saying yes, no to every question on a checklist. You want to dive deeper into it as far as the implementation and ensuring the effectiveness of the program on-site. In addition, the checklists always allow for an easy recommendation follow-up method. So this next slide just shows an example of a compliance audit checklist. This is actually one that I use to audit facilities. You'll see here I've listed out every regulatory requirement. I have a column for yes or no in compliance. And then I add a comment column, comments on where I found documentation, so that this later can be used as a roadmap. If you are finding, as I said, things out of compliance, well then you'll see that we have a recommendation there for improvement. This is just another example, you know, following an audit, I like to put in an action tracking table, and this I draw the audit recommendations, put it in one place, and it allows for an easy means for tracking those recommendations. So as I said, the day of the audit is really where we're diving in deep and doing our documentation review and interviews. During the documentation review of the compliance audit, you want to ensure that you're reviewing all the prevention program elements, including any supporting documentation that may follow with those elements. So again, I've just listed here, we went through them earlier in our previous table, but again, this is a table just showing the prevention program elements for an RMP Program 3 and PSM program. So just some key insights. When we get into this documentation review, we get into our on-site activities for the day of the audit. I said earlier I like to start by asking what the changes to the process have been, if any. I ask this first and make a quick note on this because it provides me a little note that as I go through each of these prevention program elements, These are items I need to be looking for to ensure that they updated documentation. For example, if we start off, we've gone through the facility organization, we're coordinated what we're doing, and then I say, hey, so by the way, what are the changes in the last 5 years? And they tell me, well, we rerouted piping, we added another vessel. Well, then that's a ticker for me that when I go through that process safety information and I start going through those P&IDs, I need to be looking to make sure they updated all elements of the program. Next, when you go through and review documentation, obviously this is a big one. You want to look at document revision numbers and dates, verify that they're maintaining the different documents within the program. As applicable, you want to interview individuals. This helps you assure are the procedures actually being utilized on site. And then for some facilities, they like to spend time to gather the documentation at one location. By gathering the documentation at one location, I will give you, it saves time for the on-site visit or the compliance audit. However, I always leave it as an option to the facility. Hey, if you want to gather the information beforehand, have it in one location, it's going to save me time on site. If you don't, that's fine. And that would be more realistic to, you know, EPA or OSHA coming on site, and I need to quick try to find all these documents. But it is going to require additional time then to dive through each element and ensure that they're maintaining the records on site. As you go through an audit, again, we're not only looking at program documentation, but we want to look at implementation. So if you're using a form, you know, for management of change, it requires a list of individuals to sign off on it. Is this form working? Is the method for implementing this form working? As always, when you go through an audit, look for opportunities to strengthen your program. I'll tell you, ideas about how you should implement these programs vary across different people, and so you may always find ways to improve upon. And then the big key one, be objective. We want to take the stance as, hey, I'm EPA, I'm OSHA, or I'm a state regulator coming in to audit. What are they going to find? What are they going to give me a violation for? Let me figure that out. At the closure of the compliance audit day, so on your day on site, you went through, you reviewed all the documentation. In closing that day activities, I always like to have a little closure meeting where I draw the team back together and we review the initial results with individuals that participated in the audit. This gives them an idea of what's to come in the compliance audit report. I always tell facilities, hey, let's kind of go through so you have an idea, and when I send you that compliance audit report, you're not surprised if you see 20 recommendations in that report. In addition, by having this closure meeting, it can allow for a brainstorming session. You as a group can brainstorm on how to improve the program and address the deficiencies noted. If appropriate and you are ready at this time to do so, it can also be a good time to assign recommendations that you found during the day with target completion dates. So that was kind of conducting an audit from prior to the audit up to our day on site into closing out the audit. Now I kind of want to go through prevention program review tips. So as I said, we're looking at this compliance audit specifically to RMP PSM programs. And as part of the audit, you are going to have to review the different prevention program elements. That's the purpose of the audit. So with the prevention program review tips, I added this slide in just to make note to you. I'm going to go through during this portion of the webcast tips and hints on items to look for in each prevention program element. Due to timing, I do not review every single requirement for each prevention program element. So I want to make that note so individuals aren't, she's missing a lot of the requirements for process safety information, or she's missing a lot of the requirements for operating procedures. Due to our timing, I'm really just hitting on more the big ticket items and more quick and easy tips for each prevention program element. So let's start off. Our first prevention program element we have for an RMP Program 3 and a PSM program is process safety information. And I always tell facilities, with process safety information, remember, this is going to be your guide to that process. It's going to tell me all about the chemical used in the process, all about the process itself, and then it's also going to tell me all about the equipment associated with that regulated process. And so the first thing under process safety information is I want to know about the hazards of the regulated substance. Under this bullet, the regulations are going to ask for things such as what chemical are you using? What's the physical data of that chemical? What's the toxicity data? What is the permissible exposure limit? Most of these items, you'll notice, are already included in an MSDS. So when I start to look for the hazards of the process chemical under process safety information, first thing I'm going to look for is, do you have a current MSDS for your covered chemical located in your RMP PSM binder? Because this is going to meet most of those requirements for process safety information. Next, we want to know under process safety information about the process itself. So when I dive into this section, I'm really looking for, do you have an overview of the process? Are you telling me, have you calculated the maximum intended inventory of that process? And do you have safe operating limits tables for the equipment and the process itself, or a reference to this location? I say or a reference because you'll notice, if you're familiar with the RMP PSM regulations, that operating procedures also want safe operating limits. So some facilities will put it in one place and provide a reference to another. That is perfectly fine. You can do that all day in your RMP PSM program. However, I do want to mention, if you are referencing a location, I'm going to expect that if you say, hey, it's in operating procedures, well then if I go to operating procedures, I better see that information. Otherwise, we're going to have a recommendation to update our references or update our process safety information to address that item. The next thing we want in process safety information, so you told me all about the chemical, you told me all about the process. Well, now I want to know equipment specifics about the process. Under this bullet, we're going to ask for piping and instrumentation diagrams. When they're going through and auditing, I always like to field verify the P&IDs to ensure they're current. So when we're going through and reviewing our process safety information, I'll ask a facility, can you provide me a copy of the P&IDs? Let's go out there, I'll go out there with an operator, let's go out to the process and let me walk these down. As you're walking down, you can verify that those are maintained current. A lot of the times, you're going to find that there have been changes and the P&IDs haven't been updated. So I'll have added valves, I mark up on that P&ID, and that's going to result in a recommendation then. Redline P&IDs to show current configuration, or update P&IDs to show current configuration. But it's a good idea to field verify these. In addition, under letting me know about the equipment in the process, well, I also want to see listed out materials of construction, electrical classification, design codes and standards. For your release system or ventilation system design, are there calculations? Do you describe the methodology used to calculate those numbers? And all this pertains to process safety information, items that I'm looking for as I go through an audit. Our next prevention program element is process hazard analysis. So when you get to the process hazard analysis and you're auditing that section, you really want to look at, one, has a process hazard analysis been completed? If so, has appropriate methodology been used? Did they have the correct team members present? If there were recommendations stemming from that PHA, has there been follow-up? Have they documented these as closed? And looking at past PHAs, does it show that they're revalidating it on the 5-year time frame? The big deficiency that you will find in process hazard analysis a lot for most facilities is there's no follow-up on the recommendations. It's been 3 or 4 years. Recommendations are just sitting there. No one thought to draw them out and start tracking them. And that's always an automatic recommendation for implement mechanisms to track and document closure for these recommendations because they are required to be followed up with. Our next prevention program element is operating procedures. So when you dive into operating procedures, you first want to verify that those operating procedures include steps for each operating phase as required by the regulation. Those of you familiar with RMP PSM regulations for the operating procedures, they specifically call out. They want an initial startup. They want normal operations. They want temporary operations, emergency shutdown. There's a whole little list of different operating phases. So the first thing I'm going to want to check is, did you address each of these operating phases in your procedures? After I verified that, I'm then looking for, are these operating procedures synchronized with an operator's actions in the field? Because you really want your operating procedures to be what the guys are actually doing. For this section, after I verified that each operating phase is there, I like to ask the facility, bring in an operator. Let me interview an operator, you know. Or when I get to that operator, I'll ask them, hey, if I pull out that P&ID or if we walk out to the process and I ask you, can you explain to me how to do an initial startup? As he's explaining it to me, I'm going through that procedure, seeing, is it close to what he's telling me he's doing out there in the field? You will be very surprised as you start doing this during your audit. For the most part, if you have good procedures and also a well-trained operator, they'll almost tell you word for word the valve numbers of what's listed in that procedure. If I go through that and start finding, hey, this is a little off, well then, you know, you should review them because operating procedures should be synchronized with what the guys are doing in the field. In addition with operating procedures, you also want to look that they're being reviewed annually. And this can be done, many facilities do this different ways. So some will use a certification sheet and I'll start looking for that. Others may update the revision numbers at the bottom or provide on the actual procedure an update date. So this is something we want to look for to make sure that they're being updated accordingly. Our next prevention program element we have is training. When you get to training, the first thing you're looking for is there a training program in place? With this training program, specifically under RMP PSM, we're looking at, do they cover a review of the hazards of the chemical? Do they go through operating procedures or maintenance procedures as applicable per job task? Do they go through safe work practices? Do they go through the safe operating limits of the process, emergency response procedures as applicable? So is there some kind of training program in place? Once you verify the training program in place, well then you want to look at, is training being completed as required by the regulations? So for an RMP PSM program, they require that you do an initial training for your operators as well as a refresher training every 3 years. You may have some additional training within that 3-year time frame, and that's fine. To audit this section, to audit a training program, I'll usually ask the facility for a list of employees. On that list of employees, if I choose 2 or 3 of those employees, I then want to verify that they have training records and training records are being retained for those individuals. So say, for example, you give me a list of your employees. You have Joe that's been an operator for 10 years. Well, I'm expecting to see quite a few years of training records maintained on file. I'll ask you, go to your file and can you pull me out Joe's training records? I'll then verify that training is being completed close to the time frame. Our next prevention program we have is mechanical integrity. So the mechanical integrity element is really our preventative maintenance program, our PM program. We want to ensure that you are doing preventative maintenance to prevent these pieces of equipment from failing, rather than having the fix-it-at-failure method. With the PM program, I'm looking for, does it include all equipment for the regulated process? Secondly, have you developed a formal schedule and maintenance task for the pieces of equipment based on manufacturer recommendations or operating history? And then, do you have a means to document that this maintenance is being completed according to that schedule? Lastly, I look for, do you have a method to note and correct equipment deficiencies in a timely manner? So for mechanical integrity, most facilities will use a computerized maintenance system for this element. If they are using a computerized maintenance system, well then I actually like to poll the person in charge of that maintenance program. I ask them, explain to me how you are going about this maintenance. So you're printing out the work orders weekly, how are they getting assigned, how are they getting back to you for updating into the system, and get the idea of how PMs and work orders are going through the facility. I then ask, okay, I know you have an ammonia refrigeration system and I see 5 compressors out there. Well, let's pull the maintenance task for one of those compressors. Do I have a monthly oil draining? Am I checking the shafts and bearings as applicable? Do I have a vibration analysis task? I'm looking for these maintenance tasks in that work order system. I then verify, are they completing these maintenance tasks according to schedule? If you're seeing a lot of work orders that are skipped, delayed, well then I want to know why those are being skipped and delayed. Why aren't we completing the maintenance tasks according to the schedule? For most facilities, if they're really in tune with their maintenance system, well then you'll go through that and you'll see they're closing out tasks according to their schedule and everything's fine. In addition to a computerized maintenance system, a lot of facilities will use a combination. So they'll use daily inspection logs where, once a day, once a shift, the guy goes around and he's checking flows and pressures and temperatures. And then in combination for the more actual maintenance tasks, such as, filter replacement or oil draining, that will be in the computerized maintenance system. That's fine if you're using both of those, but if you are, one, I need to know what you're doing, and then one, I need to be able to go back and pull those records and pull those log sheets to prove to me that you are actually doing these maintenance tasks. Our next prevention program element we have is management of change. So when you get to management of change, obviously your first question should always be, have there been any changes to the covered process? If there have been changes to the covered process, well then that's when I want to see your MOC documentation. Did you go through and implement the MOC form? Did you fill it out? Did you update all prevention program elements as identified on that MOC form? So here's where you're checking documentation. In the chances, you get to some facilities that, for example, have a chlorine disinfection system they use for water treatment. Those systems are really not changing, to be honest. And so for management of change, they may not have made any changes. And that's fine. Then I'm looking for, do you at least have a procedure in place? So if you were going to make a change, to document the management of change and go through the steps of management of change. Married along with the management of change is pre-startup safety review. With the pre-startup safety review, if you make major modifications to your process or you're constructing a new regulated process, well then you're supposed to do a pre-startup safety review prior to introducing that chemical into the process. So if you're in the case where you did go through a major modification, I checked your MOC documentation back when I was going through MOC. Now I want to see, did you do a pre-startup safety review? And again, pre-startup safety review is your final check that you met all requirements of MOC. If you are a new process, well then you look for pre-startup safety review just to verify, was the equipment constructed as applicable according to applicable design codes and standards? Did I do training prior to starting up this process? If there have been no MOCs completed, no major modifications to the system, well then again, you're just looking for, is there a procedure to complete a pre-startup safety review if needed? Our next prevention program element we have is compliance audits. So that's what we're going through today, is how to conduct a compliance audit, what to look for. With the compliance audit, when I get to this element, you're specifically looking for, if they're an older facility, have they completed compliance audits? Is there a compliance audit report? Does it show they're completing them on the 3-year schedule? Include the list of participants? And are any recommendations from that compliance audit followed up with or documented as closed? Our next prevention program element is incident investigation. So with the incident investigation, when you get to this section of the program, you're looking, does a procedure exist, to investigate incidents? Within that incident investigation procedure, does it include the requirement to initiate the investigation within 48 hours? Does it include a list of who the proper team members should be on the incident investigation team? Does it require that you develop a report and communicate the results of the report with affected personnel? I'm also asking, has there ever been an incident on site? So has there been a release of regulated substance? Has there been a situation where you had a near miss? Meaning, did you have an incident where it could have potentially resulted into a catastrophic release? However, I caught it in time. You should also be investigated. So at the facility, if they have had an incident, I am then looking, do they have the incident report on file? Because for incident investigation, if you had an incident, these reports must be retained for at least 5 years. Our next item we have is employee participation. With the employee participation element, you're really just looking for, is there a written plan for employee participation? You're also looking, do employees have access to RMP PSM program information? Here's where we're getting into interviewing operators, interviewing personnel. Do they know where, operating procedures are? Do they have access to them? If they wanted to see a copy of the PHA, do they know where they can get their hands on that? Because with these programs, they're meant to get employees involved. So you want them to have access to information, to the RMP PSM program information. Our next item we have is hot work permit. So these days, to be honest, with hot work permit, it's becoming pretty common for facilities. They all use kind of the same general form. With the RMP PSM program, you're really just looking, is there a procedure to issue hot work permits? And then if they're actually conducting hot work, are these permits being maintained on file? So here, most of the time, this will fall with, a maintenance department, and you'll ask them if they're doing hot work, meaning, they're cutting pipe around the process, they are welding on the process, well then I'm expecting to be able to find that they have hot work permits on file. Our next section is contractors. So with contractors, when you get to this element, you're really looking for, is there a policy to evaluate contractor records? And when we talk about contractors, we're looking at contractors that are either working on the process, they're actually working, maintaining your regulated process, or they're going to be in vicinity to your process. With this, we're supposed to evaluate them prior to them doing their work on the process to ensure we're getting qualified people to conduct the work on a regulated process. So under this section, like I said, look for a policy to evaluate their safety records and ensure they're qualified to work on that process. I'm also asking the facility, are you using contractors at this time? For example, if you have an ammonia refrigeration system, a lot of facilities use contractors to do maintenance on that system. Well, if you're using contractors, what's the name of that contractor? Can you pull me their safety records, or can you pull me the contract records that show that you evaluated their qualifications after they completed their work? Did you look at it and verify that it was up to your facility's standard? Do you have an evaluation form on site? So here's where you really want to dive into the records. I will tell you, most facilities, when it comes to contractors, I hate to say it, but there is a lot of deficiency here. And the most common thing is, you know, when you get to facilities, a lot of them will tell me, oh, I use so-and-so. Every facility uses them for their maintenance. That's fine. You know, every facility may use them. In that case, it should make it easier for you to gather their safety records from them, because they know, because all these facilities should be asking. The idea, once that contractor's on your site, he's your responsibility, so you should be verifying and keeping their safety records on site. In addition, I want to add here, a lot of facilities will have continuing contracts. So they'll use the same contractor for the last 5 years. In that case, it's good just to annually refresh those training records or OSHA injury, illness logs, those 300 logs, and refresh, make sure you have new information for them or updated information for them. Lastly, our last prevention program element is trade secrets. Now, this is going to be a federal OSHA requirement only. So, for example, if you're in California, Cal OSHA doesn't have a trade secrets in their prevention program element. If you're in a different state that has a state program, they may not necessarily have this requirement. Again, it's a federal OSHA requirement only. For the trade secrets, a lot of facilities don't have a process that's secret per se. You go to an ammonia refrigeration facility and anyone can know about that process. You can Google it and find all the information you want on ammonia refrigeration. There's nothing secret about that. With that, then, I'm just looking for, do you have a policy if there were to be some secrets or some proprietary information that you will allow access to employees so they can understand the hazards of the process? I have gone to facilities where they have utilized processes that have proprietary information. In that case, I'm really looking at this trade secret. Again, if you have a secret process, well, then you still need to be able to provide information to employees enough so that they can understand the hazards posed to them. And this is really what that trade secrets requirement is hitting on. So that goes through kind of some tips and hints on what to look for during the compliance audit. Now, as you go through these different prevention program elements and you find deficiencies, you should make a recommendation. And recommendation is actions to take to correct that deficiency and improve in the future to prevent that deficiency occurring in the future. Following the compliance audit, these recommendations will need to be followed up on and closed out. So I'll tell you, you know, I've audited a lot of facilities. I think in the last 3 months I've been around to like 6 to 8 facilities. I get called in a lot for audits. I really enjoy it and helping out the facility correct their deficiencies. The most common program deficiency that you will find at facilities is addressing recommendations. A lot of facilities make recommendations and will have no way to track them, or they'll forget about them. You know, if you made them in the PHA 4 years ago, you have changeover in personnel, they tend to really get lost in the shuffle. So with addressing recommendations and following up, you are going to have recommendations from your compliance audit that you just did. You may have it from your process hazard analysis. If you had an incident, your incident investigation may have recommendations. And sometimes as you go back through to follow up on these recommendations and review them, you may think, why did we make that recommendation? Doesn't seem like it would be applicable here. Well, you can actually decline a recommendation. This just provides you an overview that OSHA gives general guidance on if you are going to decline a recommendation. So let's start off. Recommendations have to be followed up with. You have to have some closure to them. If you look at that recommendation and you find there's factual errors, not necessary, to protect workers, you find an alternative measure would be cheaper and possibly, work the same level as that recommendation, or the recommendation's infeasible, you can decline that recommendation and justifiably close that out. With the recommendation follow-up, so as I said, as you go through this audit and you find deficiencies, you make a recommendation and they require follow-up. Well, with following up on recommendations, usually what helps it out is you assign an individual responsible for following up on the recommendation. Assign an anticipated date to get that done by, a target completion date. And then as you go through, for an RMP PSM coordinator, I tell them a lot of the time, once you assign that target completion date, well, then we need to kind of turn on the pest factor. And I'm emailing that individual every few months, where are we at with this recommendation? Give me some closure comments. Again, with recommendations, after we've assigned them with target completion dates, there should be some follow-up. And as you close out those recommendations, in your documentation, you want to list the actions taken to close out those recommendations and then label it as closed. From this point, once you've closed out recommendations, I've had facilities ask, can I just delete them out of my tracking log? And I tell them, no, with these recommendations, as we go through and close them out, you leave them in there because it shows a history of you improving on the program, making effort towards the program, and, doing and trying to utilize and implement the RMP PSM program effectively on site. So one thing just to remember that, with all these recommendations, even if you do them all and you don't keep your documentation up to date, then it can be a deficiency. In review, these RMP PSM programs with the prevention program elements are really meant to be a living, breathing program, meaning they're supposed to be used. You're supposed to be periodically updating them. You start by developing a program at your site and implementing it. You then will evaluate the effectiveness and that you're meeting the requirements with that program through your compliance audit. From the compliance audit, you're going to find deficiencies that happen, but this gives us a chance to correct those deficiencies, again, implement it, and just continue down the cycle. It's not supposed to meant to be the dusty binder on the shelf. We want to take that dusty binder off and put it into use. So in review, I just want to end on, we've gone through a lot of different elements today. Remember, when you go to do your compliance audit, you want to ensure you have the appropriate team of individuals. A lot of people use the compliance audit as a training tool for individuals new to RMP PSM programs to learn the requirements. However, by defining the schedule, it ensures we have the appropriate people assigned and then allows us to not include everyone if not necessary, because a lot of people are busy on site. When you go through your audit, we want to ensure a method to document the results. We need to come up with a compliance audit report. You need to, when you go through your audit, ensure every regulatory requirement is met. This is your chance to verify that. As applicable, supporting documentation should be reviewed. Again, when you do the audit, also look for program implementation. And the big bullet in red, you have to be objective. You have to come in with the stance and pretend I'm an EPA or OSHA inspector. What am I finding at my facility? And make sure you identify those deficiencies. And then with the deficiencies still, we're going to have recommendations, so we'll want to follow up on those. So that's it. I hope everyone found this very helpful. I know we went through a lot of stuff. If you have any questions, then please feel free to type into Nicole, and she'll ask me. If you don't want to ask your question now, you think of a question later, you can always call or email me. I know for myself, that happens a lot. I'll think of a question like an hour later. That's fine. Please feel free to email or call me with your question.
No questions at this time, Teresa.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for participating, and I hope you enjoyed the session. In addition, if you have any further topics that you feel would be applicable to be covered, or you'd like us to consider covering in a webcast, please feel free to also email that. And thank you for your time this morning.